Chapter 18, Elba. Was it love alone which moved Napoleon to such a display of confidence and affection towards his wife, or had policy any part in his conduct? Did he imagine that the Austrian emperor would be turned aside from his purpose when he encountered his daughter and his grandson, and would hold his hand, powerless to strike the threatened blow? By appointing the empress to the regency, did he hope to prepare the ground for an act of personal abdication, whereby his dynasty at least might be saved in the event of irreparable disaster? And did he dream that the sovereigns of Europe, finding his throne in the possession of a distinguished member of their own caste, would hesitate to overthrow it, would accept and confirm the substitution he had himself effected, and instead of driving out his son, would make it their common interest to protect his rights? If we accept such hypothesis, we shall be forced to conclude that Napoleon despaired of his own fortune so early as April 1813, before the Battle of Lutzen, before the first campaign in which he gave evidence so numerous and striking of his continued faith in his star. It may, however, be readily admitted that he had occasional misgivings in connection with the Austrian alliance, that he looked upon Marie-Louise as a pledge of national friendship, and that he relied on the good faith of Francis II, his good faith less as emperor than as father-in-law. It would have required a kindred baseness of which no Frenchman of the Revolutionary era, Talleyrand and Fouché hardly excepted, was capable to divine the plot hatched against Napoleon by the aristocrats of Europe, and to recognize in the young girl they had thrown into his arms the decoy of an oligarchic coalition, the conception and execution of such a scheme, which brought the concentrated venom of all the ancient courts of Europe into play about his nuptial bed, could have emanated only from those depths of corruption peculiar to the patrician society of the time, a caste unscrupulous by tradition and education, obedient to no law, human or divine, beyond that of self-interest, and careless by what means a coveted end was attained, above all conscious of no dishonor, when they perverted love, the most sacred of human emotions, into an ambush for their enemy. For this was one of the stratagems most approved among them. In this case, a wife and not a mistress had been required. They had given her. What matter if, when the avenging car crushed the blasphemer who had laid a sacrilegious hand on the ark, the wheels should rend the quivering flesh and blonde tresses of an Austrian archduchess? Should she survive the ordeal, her future should be cared for. She would be consoled. Should she die, so much the worse for her. Such a game was not to be played without a stake, and here the stake was only a woman. Napoleon seems to have had no suspicion of treachery. He would never suffer the hypothesis that his wife had been in league with his enemies, and he was right, for she had been kept entirely in the dark. And so well fitted was she by nature for her part that no prompting could have improved her rendering of it. Whether she shrank instinctively from discussion of the subject or was reluctant to recognize the chief cause of his overthrow, it was not till a much later period that Napoleon showed any disposition to connect his second marriage with the events that followed. It was the abyss, he said at St. Helena, but they covered it with flowers. He seems, however, to have avoided dwelling on the matter, as if recoiling from the depths of baseness further investigation would reveal. He wished no stigma to attach to his wife for her memory, and sought to exculpate her in the eyes of history, relieving her of all responsibility in the great catastrophe to which his own blind confidence had so largely contributed, a catastrophe which, to the uninitiated, ignorant of its baser causes, has all the vast and fateful simplicity of an Aeschylean tragedy. Far from visiting his downfall on the woman by whose means he had been overthrown, his love and confidence seems to increase with his misfortunes, as if to console her for the aggressions of her nation and the raising of her father's standard against her husband. Events she could not but regard as an outrage to herself. Even in this extremity, he still preserved some confidence in himself and his fortunes. It was his nature to hope, even against hope, and this virtue of great souls has made many days in the fatal campaign of France worthy of record on the same page as the immortal day at Castiglione. Not till the very last would he admit the possibility of the entry of the Allies into Paris and the capture of the Empress and the King of Rome. When forced to face such a possibility, he dismissed the occupation of the capital as a temporary triumph by which his plan of operation would be very slightly affected, but he could not suffer his wife and son to fall into the hands of the victors. Rather than subject them to such an indignity, he ordered Joseph to abandon Paris, taking away with him all elements of resistance and all government officials. By this measure, he dealt the death blow to his own authority, for Talleyrand readily found a pretext for remaining behind. His web had long been ready woven, its meshes enclosed accomplices in every department of the state, among the immediate followers of Joseph and the Empress in the prefecture of the Seine, among the police, over all of whom he exercised an influence so mysterious as to suggest some medieval compact with the powers of darkness. By their help he accomplished in 1814 the work of treason he had begun at Tilsit, but to overthrow Napoleon's empire by the help of 500,000 foreign bayonets was only an item in Talleyrand's program. He had further determined to destroy the ties he himself had chiefly contributed to form between Napoleon and Marie Louise. The emperor imagined that the supreme consolation of his wife and son's companionship would still be in his exile. He gave the Empress no positive injunctions to join him at Fontainebleau, believing no doubt that her tears would touch the Emperor Francis, and that her personal intercession would best guarantee her own future. But he made up his mind that she would come to him as soon as his establishment was organized, that some independent sovereignty would be assigned her adjoining the petty principality he had resigned himself, or thought he had resigned himself to rule, knowing, as he said, that she had loved the man rather than the emperor and him. He hoped that life might still hold some happiness for him, and for the child they would see growing to manhood beside them. Marie Louise was perfectly ready to play the part assigned her in these dreams. She loved her husband and would gladly have followed him, but for every faithful heart around her there were 100 utterly venal and corrupt. She, who from her earliest childhood had never been allowed to think for herself, who had all her life been subjected to the severest discipline, and in whom obedience to some superior will had become second nature, found herself suddenly thrown on her own resources. Her father's hand closed slowly upon her. She struggled at first, through love for her husband getting the better of her filial respect, but Talleyrand determined to crush that love. Among Marie Louise's ladies was one whom he had secured for his own purposes, and who was notoriously one of the most astute and scheming spirits of her time. She knew neither scruples nor gratitude. In her youth she had been given to amorous adventures of the Italian type, and had retained her passion for intrigue in all its vigor. She was in her element in any diplomatic imbroglio. Unlike the greater number of the Empress's ladies in waiting who had retired to their homes, she had remained at the palace, and finding herself practically alone with her mistress, she promptly opened her batteries, acting throughout on Talleyrand's instructions. She first hinted, then boldly affirmed that the emperor had never loved his wife, and had persistently deceived her. Finding the empress hard to convince, Madame de Brignol produced the two valets who had just abandoned their master and benefactor at Fontainebleau. These men had been previously schooled by Talleyrand and herself, and were prepared to swear to anything she wished. At this crisis, Marie Louise's soft and yielding temperament looked in vain for support and sympathy. There was no one to defend the absent, to breathe courage and resolution into that girlish heart. Marie Louise's nature was an eminently material one, and her mortification at these disclosures was far greater than her despair at the downfall of her throne, just as she had allowed herself to be given up a passive victim of modern Iphigenia. So now she suffered herself to be recaptured. Policy, as Schwarzenberg declared, should untie the knot which policy had tied. It was not the work of an hour. For nearly a whole year she struggled against the combined forces of Europe, and all the wiles of diplomacy were called into action to get the better of her schoolgirl heart. Pride, vanity, jealousy, and envy were played upon in turn, but the victory was only accomplished when she had been induced to replace love by love, and the respectable Emperor of Austria had driven his daughter into open concubinage. Then all monarchical Europe applauded, and adultery was rewarded by a kingdom.